Breathing. Rarely is any thought really given to it. It simply occurs constantly as an involuntary action. Yet so important is this involuntary action that if the lungs lack access to air for more than a few minutes at most, life passes from our bodies. An average of 20 times per minute, we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So how does the respiratory system that the Lord designed get this oxygen into the blood so we can use it? The respiratory system actually lies dormant in the human fetus during pregnancy, but at birth, the respiratory system becomes fully functional upon our exposure to the air, although some lung development and growth continues throughout childhood. Respiration is achieved through the mouth, nose, trachea, lungs, and diaphragm, and regulated through the phrenic nerve which controls the diaphragm. Oxygen enters the respiratory system through the mouth and the nose, where every minute you breathe in 13 pints of air. The nasal cavity is lined with fine hairs to filter any dust or particles that would contaminate the air, as well as a rich supply of blood vessels that keep the air warm. As the air enters the nose, the curved nature draws air in a circular pattern, which warms it and removes any particles. The oxygen then passes through the larynx, where speech sounds are produced, and the trachea, which is a tube that enters the chest cavity. In the chest cavity, the trachea tube split into two smaller tubes called the bronchi. Each bronchus then divides again, forming the bronchial tubes. These bronchial tubes, likewise, are lined with cells that moisten the air and fine hairs that beat upwards to trap and expel any particles that may have slipped by the nasal cavity. These ciliary hairs are all aligned to work together, millions of them waving 20 times per second to move the mucus and any particles away from the air sacs. The bronchial tubes lead directly into the lungs, where they divide into smaller tubes which connect to tiny sacs called alveoli. The bronchial tubes themselves are made up of cartilage material that holds its structure as we bend and move without being so stiff that we would be restricted. The average adult's lungs contain 1,500 miles of airways and about 600 million of these spongy, air-filled sacs that are surrounded by capillaries. The inhaled oxygen passes into the alveoli and then diffuses through the capillaries into the arterial blood. Meanwhile, the waste-rich blood from the veins releases its carbon dioxide into the alveoli. The carbon dioxide follows the same path out of the lungs when you exhale. What essentially happens is that the oxygen is pulled into smaller and smaller compartments, until the walls of these compartments, the alveoli, are so small and thin that the gases can diffuse directly in and out of the capillaries. When breathing in, the diaphragm contracts, increasing the volume of the chest cavity, and the muscles around the ribs pull the ribs up, further increasing this volume. This increase of volume lowers the air pressure in the alveoli to below atmospheric pressure. Because air always flows from a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure, it rushes in through the respiratory tract and into the alveoli. This is called negative pressure breathing, changing the pressure inside the lungs relative to the pressure of the outside atmosphere. In contrast, when exhaling, the diaphragm and rib muscles relax. This returns the chest cavity to its original volume, increasing the air pressure in the lungs and forcing the air out. There is such a wonderful mechanism and system to our breathing. All the safeguards that go into protecting our air from contaminants, and the incredible system for moving air into the blood and waste out. The Bible tells us that it is breath that gives us life, and we can see from looking at the respiratory system that this is true. It's interesting to note that the technical term for breathing in is inspiration. Given these facts, isn't it interesting that Paul said in 2 Timothy 3:16 that all scripture is God-breathed? The metaphor holds true when we consider how much we are nourished by the Word of God and how quickly our spiritual life will wither without it. When it comes to your spiritual respiratory system, have you been holding your breath? Not breathing in the Word? Perhaps it's time you started breathing more heavily.